Okay, check one, two, three, four. Hello, hello, we're back. What's up? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 2, or Book 2, of the Magic the Gathering audiobook series. My name is Phil Dawson. I'm happy to be with you once again to rekindle the journey we've only recently just begun. And I must tell you, the last few months have been wild. I have a beautiful and healthy baby daughter, which is just amazing. I'm still inching ever so closer to like a career goal and starting a beer brewery here in Japan. And this little project has been its own exciting ride as we near 10,000 listens to book one, which is awesome. And some of the feedback I've received has been truly humbling, and it really makes me feel good to know that you are enjoying it. It's really quite cool, too, to see people from all over the world listening in. And I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in. And with that being said, I have started a Patreon page linked on my Twitter, and I think on this site page, too. We'll figure that out as we get there. As I received a request from a listener who wants to support financially what I'm doing here. And who am I to say no to that? So, in fact, I'd love feedback on that page and the offerings itself. We have 3 different tiers: goblins, angels, and planeswalkers. And also, if you're a business, we have slots available for show title sponsorship as well. So, with that being said, please check it out. Again, I hope my work here garners your support and appreciation. And as always, please share it with your friends and families and play groups and local game stores, your online areas that you hang out, and because the more the merrier here. Plus, something very cool if you didn't know or didn't see, at the end of 2022, the Magic set that's being released in the cardboard version, is the Brothers' War. So the cards will coincide with the novel we just read, which is a really cool thing to see and watch it be brought to life by the artists and the cards themselves. So it's a perfect way to get someone hooked on the lore, and you can go right to the cards and like relive the story in your hand. So it's awesome. Lastly, a shout out, of course, to my play group and the guys who got me into Magic. I miss you guys a bunch: Corey and Buckets, and Tom and Tim and Jigga, and fellow new dad Blake, Ripo and Casey and Mox Mike, and of course, rest in peace to Bo. You guys are with me always. So this is round 2. Let's have another round of fun following what Urza is up to. So thank you so much for listening. We'll talk again soon, but let's get to it. Season 2, Book 2 of the Artifact Cycle, Planeswalker. Planeswalker by Lynn Abbey. Magic the Gathering. Artifact Cycle, Book 2. Chapter 1. A man descended. His journey had begun in the clouds, riding the winds in search of a place remembered but no longer known. He'd found the place as he'd found it before, by following the ancient glyphs and ancient folk had carved into the land. Glyphs that had endured millennia of neglect in the cataclysmic finale of the Brothers' War 5 years ago. Much of Terrasire had vanished in the cataclysm, reduced to dust by fratricidal hatred. That dust still swirled overhead. Everyone coughed, and harvests were sparse. But the sunsets and sunrises were magnificent, luminous streaks of amber reaching across the sky, seeking escape from a ruined world. The brothers, in whose names the war had been fought, had been reduced to curses. By Urza's whim and Mishra's might, may you rot forever beneath the forests of sunken Argoth. Rumors said that Urza had caused the cataclysm when he used Latnam's sorcery to fuel his final, most destructive artifact. Others said that the cataclysm was Mishra's curse as he died with Urza's hands clasped around his throat. A few insisted that Urza had survived his crimes. Within a year of the cataclysm, all the rumors had merged in an increasingly common curse. If I had met Urza on the road, I'd cripple him with my own 2 hands, as he and his brother crippled us. Then I'd leave him for the rats and the vultures, as he left Mishra. Urza had survived. He'd heard the curse in its infinite variations. After nearly 5 years in self-chosen exile, the erstwhile Lord Protector of the realm had spent another year walking amongst the folks of blasted Terrasair. The dregs of Yosha, the survivors of Argiv, the tattered, the famished, the lame, the disheartened. No one had recognized him. Few had known him, even in his glory days. Urza had never been one to harangue his troops with rhetoric. He'd been an inventor, a scholar, an artificer such as the world had not seen since the Thran, and all he ever wanted was to study in peace. He had that peace once, near the beginning, and lost it, as he'd lost everything, to the man, the abomination his brother had become. A handful of Urza's students had survived the cataclysm. They denounced their master, and Urza hadn't troubled them with a visit. Urza's wife, Kayla bin Krug, had survived too. She now dwelt in austere solitude with her grandson, writing an epic she called the Antiquity Wars. Urza hasn't visited her either. Kayla alone might have recognized him, and he had no words for her. As for her grandson Jarsel, black-haired and stocky, charming, amiable, and quick-witted, Urza had glimpsed the young man just once, and that had been one time too many. His descent continued. Urza had not wanted to return to this place where the war had, in a very real sense, begun nearly 50 years earlier. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd done to end the war. Filling the bowl-shaped Silex with his memories had been an act of desperation. The Silex itself had been a sudden, suspect gift, and until that day he'd neither studied nor practiced sorcery. He hadn't known what using the Silex would do, but the war had to be stopped. The thing his brother had become had to be stopped, else Terrasair's fate would have been worse, much worse. No, Urza would not apologize, but he was not pleased by his own survival. Urza should have died when the Silex emptied. He suspected that he had died, but the Power Stones, over which he and his brother had contended, had preserved him. When Urza had awakened, the 2 Thran jewels had become his eyes. All Thran devices had been powered by such faceted stones, but his Might Stone and Mishra's Weak Stone had been as different from ordinary Power Stones as a candle to the sun. Once rejoined within Urza's skull, the Thran jewels had restored him to his prime. He had no need for food or rest, though he continued to sleep because a man needed dreams, even when he no longer needed rest. And his new eyes gave him vision that reached around dark corners into countless other worlds. Urza believed that in time the battered realms of Terrasair would recover, even thrive, but he had not wished to watch that excruciatingly slow process, and so he walked away. For 5 years after the Silex-engendered cataclysm, Urza had explored the round-the-corner worlds his faceted eyes revealed. In one such world he'd met another traveler, a woman named Meshivel, who confirmed what he had already guessed. He'd lost his mortality the day he destroyed Mishra. The blast had slain him, and the Thran Power Stones had brought him back to life because he had always been, a Planeswalker, like Meshivel herself. Meshivel explained to Urza that the worlds he visited were merely a handful of the infinite planes of the multiverse, any of which could be explored and exploited by an immortal Planeswalker. She taught Urza to change his shape at will and to comprehend thought without the inconvenience of language or translation. But even among Planeswalkers, Urza was unique. For all her knowledge, Meshivel couldn't see the multiverse as Urza saw it. Her eyes were an ordinary brown, and she'd never heard of the Thran. Meshivel could tell Urza nothing about his eyes, except that she feared them, and feared them so much that she tried to snare him in a time pit. When that failed, she fled the plane where they'd been living. Urza had thought about pursuing Meshivel, more from curiosity than vengeance, but the plane she called Dominaria, the plane where he'd been born, the plane he'd nearly destroyed, kept its claws in his mind. 5 years after the cataclysm, Dominaria pulled him home. Urza's descent ended on a wind-eroded plateau. Clouds thickened, turned gray. Cold wind, sharp with ice and dust, plastered long strands of ash-blonde hair across Urza's eyes. Winter had come earlier than Urza had expected, another unwelcome gift from the Silex. A few more days and the glyphs would have been buried until spring. 4 millennia ago, the Thran had transformed the plateau into a fortress, an isolated stronghold wherein they had made their final stand. Presumably it once had a name. Perhaps the glyphs proclaimed it still, but no one had cracked that enigmatic code, and no one had cracked that afternoon. Urza's jeweled eyes gave him no insight into their maker's language. 50 years ago, in his natural youth, Urza and his brother had named the great cavern within the plateau Koilos, and Koilos it remained. Koilos had been ruins then, now the ruins were themselves ruined. But not merely by the Silex. The brothers and their war had wrought this damage, plundering the hollow plateau for Thran secrets, Thran power stones. In truth, Urza had expected worse. Mishra had held this part of Tercire for most of the war, and it pleased Urza to believe that his brother's allies had been more destructive than his own allies had been. In a dusty corner of his heart, Urza knew that he had been able to ravage Koilos. Even the shadows would have been stripped from the stones. But Mishra's minions had plied their rubble neatly, almost reverently. Their shredded tents still flapped in the rising wind. Looking closer, Urza realized they'd left suddenly and without their belongings, summoned, perhaps to Argoth, as Urza had summoned his followers for that final battle 5 years earlier. Urza paused on the carefully excavated path. He closed his eyes and shuddered as memories flooded his mind. He and Mishra had fought from the beginning in a sunlit Argiv nursery. How could they not, when he was the eldest by less than a year and Mishra was the brother everyone liked better? Yet they'd been inseparable, so keenly aware of their differences that they'd come to rely on the other's strengths. Urza never learned the arts of friendship or affection because he had Mishra between him and the rest of the world. And Mishra, what had he given Mishra? What had Mishra ever truly needed from him? How long? Urza asked the wind in a whisper that was both rage and pain. When did you first turn away from me? Urza reopened his eyes and resumed his trek. He left no footprints in the dust and snow. Nothing distracted him. The desiccated corpse propped against one tent pole wasn't worth a second glance, despite the metal plates rusting on its brow or the brass pinchers replacing its left arm. Urza had seen what his brother had become. It wasn't surprising to him that Mishra's disciples were similarly grotesque. His faceted eyes peered into darkness, seeing nothing. Now, that was a surprise and a disappointment. Urza had expected insight the way a child expects a present on New Year's morning. Disappoint Mishra and you've gotten a summer tantrum, loud, violent, and quickly passed. Disappoint Urza and Urza got cold and quiet, like ice, till he had thawed through the problem. After 4,000 years, had they plundered the last Thran Power Stone, exposed the last artifact? Was there nothing left for his eyes to see? A dull blue glint caught Urza's attention. He wrenched a palm-sized chunk of metal free from the rocks and rubble. Immediately it moved in his hand, curving back on itself. It was Thran, of course. An artificer of Urza's skill didn't need jeweled eyes to recognize that ancient craftsmanship. Only the Thran had known how to forge a sort of sentience between motes of metal. But Urza saw the blue-gray metal more clearly than ever before. With time, the right tools, the right reagents, and a bit of luck, he might be able to decipher its secrets. Then, acting without deliberate thought, as he very rarely did, Urza drove his right thumbnail into the harder-than-steel surface. He thought of a groove, a very specific groove that matched his nail. When he lifted his thumb, the groove was in the metal and remained as he slowly counted to 10. I see it. Yes, I see it. So simple, once it can be seen. Urza thought of Mishra, spoke to Mishra. No one else, not even his master student Tawnos, could have grasped the shifting symmetries his thoughts had imposed on the ancient metal. As if it had been your thumb, Urza conceded to the wind. Impulse, like friendship, had been Mishra's gift. Urza could almost see him standing there, brash and brilliant and not a day over 18. An ice crystal died in Urza's lashes. He blinked and saw Mishra's face, slashed and tattered, hanging by flesh threads in the cogs of a glistening engine. Phyrexia! He swore and hurled the shard into the storm. It bounced twice, ringing like a bell, then vanished. Phyrexia! He learned the word 5 years ago, the very day of the Cataclysm, when Tawnos had brought him the Silex. Tawnos had gotten the bowl from Ashnod, and for that reason alone, Urza would have cast it aside. But he fought Mishra once already that fateful day. For the first time, Urza had poured himself into his stone, the Might Stone, and if his brother had been a man, his brother would have died. But Mishra had no longer been a man. He hadn't died, and Urza needed whatever help fate offered. In those chaotic moments, as their massed war engines turned on one another, there'd been no time to ask questions or consider implications. Urza believed Mishra had transformed himself into a living artifact, and that abominable act had justified the Silex. It was after, when there was no one left to ask, that the questions had surfaced. Tawnos had mentioned a demon, a creature from Phyrexia, that had ambushed him and Ashnod. Never mind the circumstances that had brought Urza's only friend and his brother's treacherous lieutenant together on the Argoth battlefield. Tawnos and Ashnod had been lovers once, and love, other than an abstract devotion to inquiry or knowledge, meant very little to Urza. Ask instead, what was a Phyrexian doing in Argoth? Why had it usurped all the artifacts, his and Mishra's? Then, ask a final question. What had he or Mishra to do with Phyrexia that its demon had become their common enemy? Some exotic force, some Phyrexian force, had conspired against them. Wandering utterly alone across the ruins of Terrasair, there had seemed no other explanation. In the end, in the forests of Argoth, only the Silex had prevented a Phyrexian victory. Within a year of the Cataclysm, Urza had tracked the Silex back through Ashnod's hands to a woman named Lauren, whom he had met in his youth. Though Lauren had studied the Thran with him and Mishra under the tutelage of the archaeologist Tokasia, she turned away from artifice and became a scholar in the ivory towers of Terisia City, a witness to the land-based power the Silex had unleashed. The residents of Terisia City had sacrificed half their number to keep the bowl out of his or Mishra's hands. Half hadn't been enough. Lauren had lost the Silex and the use of her right arm to Ashnod's infamous inquiries, but the rest of her had survived. Urza had approached Lauren warily, disguised as a woman who'd lost her husband and both her sons in what he bitterly described as the brothers' cursed folly. Lauren was a competent sage and a better person than Urza hoped to be, but she was no match for his jeweled eyes. As she heated water on the charcoal brazier, he'd stolen her memories. The Silex, of course, was gone, consumed by the forces it had released, and Lauren's memory of it was imperfect. That was Ashnod's handiwork. The torturer had taken no chances with her many victims. Lauren recalled a copper bowl incised with Thran glyphs. Urza had forgotten until he saw them again in Lauren's memory. Some of the glyphs were sharp enough to be recognized, if he saw them again, but they were mostly blurred. He could have sharpened those memories. His eyes had that power, but Urza knew better than to make that suggestion. Lauren would sooner die than help him, so they drank tea, watched a brilliant sunset, then went their separate ways. Urza had learned enough. The Thran, the vanished race who had inspired his every artifact, had made the Silex, and the Silex had saved Dominaria from Phyrexia. Although mysteries remained, there was symmetry, and Urza had hoped that symmetry would be enough to halt his dreams. He resumed his planeswalking. It had taken 5 years. Urza was nothing, if not determined, even stubborn, before he'd admitted to himself that his hopes were futile. A year ago, he returned to Dominaria, to Argoth itself, which he'd avoided since the war ended. He found the ruined hilltop where he'd unleashed the land's fury and pain. He'd found Tawnos' coffin. Tawnos had spent 5 years sealed in stasis within the coffin. For him, it was as if the war hadn't yet ended and the cataclysm hadn't yet happened. The crisp images on the surface of Tawnos' awakened mind had been battlefield chaos, Ashnod's lurid hair, and the demon from Phyrexia. If this thing is here, Tawnos had recalled his erstwhile lover's one-time torturer's words. Ashnod's statement had implied, at least to Tawnos and from him to Urza, that she recognized the demon, a man-tall construction of strutted metal and writhing, segmented wires. Urza recognized it too, or parts of it. He'd seen similar wires uncoiled from his brother's flenched body, attaching Mishra to the dragon engine. "This one is mine," more of Ashnod's sultry words lying fresh in Tanos' mind. Urza's only friend had wanted to argue with Ashnod to die beside her. She wouldn't grant him that dubious honor. Instead, she'd given him the Silex. Tanos' memories had clouded quickly as he'd absorbed the vastly changed landscape. While Tanos had sorted his thoughts, Urza had looked westward to the battlefield, now replaced by ocean. Ashnod, as treacherous as she'd been beautiful, had betrayed everyone who fell into her power. Tanos' back still bore the scars. Mishra had judged her so unreliable that he banished her, only to let her back for the last battle. Or had he? Had Mishra known Ashnod carried the Silex? Had the traitor himself been betrayed? Which was the puppet? Which was the master? Why had the demon stalked Ashnod across the battlefield? What was her connection to Phyrexia? Urza had wrestled with such questions until Tanos asked his own. Your brother? Dead, Urza had replied as his questions converged on a single answer. Long before I found him. The words had satisfied Tanos, who began at once to talk of other things, of rebuilding the land and restoring its vitality. Tanos, dear friend Tanos, had always been an optimist. Urza left him standing by the coffin, certain they'd never meet again. For Urza, the realization that he hadn't slain Mishra with the Silex had given him a sense of peace that almost lasted a month, till a new, stronger wave of guilt had engulfed it. He was the elder brother, charged from birth with his younger siblings' care. He'd failed. When Mishra had need of an elder brother's help, that elder brother had been elsewhere. He failed Mishra and all of Dominaria. His brother had died alone, betrayed by Ashnod, transformed by a Phyrexian demon into a hideous amalgam of flesh and artifice. Urza had returned to Argoth and Tanos as the snows had begun, almost exactly 1 year ago. He denied himself sleep or shelter, kneeling in the snow, waiting for Mishra or death. It hadn't mattered which. But Mesheval had been correct. Urza had transcended death, and he'd found, to his enduring dismay, that he lacked the will for suicide. A late spring had freed him from his icy prison. He stood up, no weaker than he'd been when he knelt down. The left side of his face had been raw, where bitter tears had leaked from the weak stone, but it had healed quickly within a few moments. He'd walk away with no marks from his season-long penance. In his youth, when his wife's realm of Yosha had still sparkled in the sun, a man named Rusko had told Urza that a man had many souls throughout his life, and that after death each soul was judged according to its deeds. Urza had outlived his souls. The Silex had blasted him out of the judgment's hand. No penance would ever dull the ache of failure. All that remained was vengeance. Urza had spent the spring and summer assuring himself that Ashnod had not survived. He'd skipped through the plains, returning after each unreal stride to Dominaria in search of a woman who was too proud to change her appearance or her ways. When fall had arrived without a trace of her, Urza had turned his attention to Koilos, where he and Mishra had come to manhood pursuing relics of the Thran. His immortal memory, he discovered, was fallible. Planeswalking couldn't easily take him to a place he didn't quite remember. In the end, searching for places that had faded from memory, he'd been reduced to surveying vast tracts of barren land from the air, as he and his brother had surveyed in their youth. He'd had given his eyes and immortality to have back just one of those days he and Mishra had spent in Tokasia's camp. Sleety winds shot up his sleeves. Urza wasn't immune to the discomforts of cold, merely to their effects. He thought of a felted cloak. It spread downward from his shoulders, thickening as he added a fur lining, then gloves, fleece-lined boots, and a soft-brim hat that didn't move in the wind. He continued along the path Mishra's workers had left. As before, and despite his new boots, Urza left no footprints. With each stride, pain ratcheted through his skull. This close to the place where they'd been joined for a millennia, his jeweled eyes recalled another purpose. Hoping to dull the pain, Urza turned his back to the cavern. His throbbing eyes saw the snow-etched ruins as shadows painted on gauzy cloth. Nothing like the two real visions he'd suffered the day he'd acquired the Mightstone. Then the shadows expanded and began to move. They were different from his earlier visions, but not entirely. Where before he had watched white-robed men constructing black metal spiders, now he saw a battlefield swarming with artifacts. Another Argoth, but without the demonic disorder. At first, Urza couldn't distinguish the two forces, as an observer might not have been able to distinguish his army from Mishra's. But as he looked, the lines of battle became clear. One side had its back against the cavern and was fighting for the freedom of the plains beyond the hollow plateau. The other formed an arc as it emerged from the narrow defile that was the only way to those plains, meaning to crush its enemy against the cliffs. Blinding flashes and plumes of dense smoke erupted everywhere, testaments to the desperation with which both sides fought. Urza strained his eyes. One force had to be the Thran, but which? And what power opposed them? During the moments that Urza pondered, the Defile force scored a victory. A swarm of their smaller artifacts stormed the behemoth that anchored the enemy center. It went down in a whirlwind of flame that drove both forces back. The Defile force regrouped quicker and took a bite from the cavern's force's precious ground. A Midgard cadre from the Defile brought rays of white light to bear on the behemoth's smoldering hulk. Soot rained and the hulk glowed red. Caught up in the visions, Urza began to count. 1, 2. The hulk's flank burst, and all too familiar segmented wires uncoiled. Tipped with scythes, the wires slashed through the Defile cadre, winnowing it by half. But too late. The Thran power stones completed the destruction of the Phyrexian behemoth. Millennia after the battle's dust had settled, Urza clenched his jaws together in a grimly satisfied smile. Ebb and flow were obvious. Now that he had identified the Thran and their goal, to drive the Phyrexians into the cavern where, presumably, they could be annihilated. It was, as the Argoth battle between him and Mishra had been, a final battle. Retreat was not an option to Phyrexians, and the Thran offered no quarter. Urza lost interest in his own time as the Shadow War continued. The Phyrexians assembled behind their last behemoth, charged the Thran line on its right flank, and very nearly broke through, but the Thran held nothing back. As ants might swarm a fallen bit of fruit, they converged upon the Phyrexian bulge. Again, it became impossible to distinguish one force from the other. Urza counted to 110, by which time there was no movement within the shadows. When he reached 112, the shadows brightened to desert noon brilliance. Reflexively, Urza shielded his eyes. When he lowered his hand, there was only snow. The pain in his skull was gone. He entered the cavern thoroughly sobered by what he had seen. His eyes had recorded the final battle between the Thran and the Phyrexians. It seemed reasonable to assume that recording Phyrexian defeats was part of their function. From that assumption, it was easy to conclude that the Thran had intended the recording stones as a warning to all those who came after. Urza had a vision when he first touched what became his Might Stone. He recalled it as he entered the cavern. Despite his best efforts, the images were dreamlike, yet they strengthened his newborn conviction. The Thran had vanished because they'd sacrificed themselves to defeat the Phyrexians. Within the cavern, Urza gazed up at the rough ceiling. "We didn't know," he explained to any lingering Thran ghosts. We didn't know your language. We didn't guess what we couldn't understand." He knew now. The artifact in which they'd found the single stone, the artifact that he and Mishra had destroyed utterly, had been the Thran legacy to Dominaria, and the means through which they locked their enemy out of Dominaria. "We didn't know." When the stone had split into its opposing parts, the lock had been sprung, and the Phyrexians had returned. The enemy had known better than to approach him, the bearer of the Might Stone, but they must have, suborned, corrupted, and destroyed Mishra, who had only the weak stone for protection. The stones were not, after all, truly equal. Might was naturally dominant over weakness, as Urza, the elder brother, should have been dominant over the younger. But, blinded by an elder brother's prejudice and, admit it, jealousy, Urza had done nothing. No, he'd done worse than nothing. He blamed Mishra, gone to war against Mishra, and undone the Thran sacrifice. Guilt was a throbbing presence within Urza's skull. He closed his eyes and clapped his hands over his ears, but that only made everything worse. Why hadn't he and Mishra talked? Through their childhood and youth, he and Mishra had fought constantly and bitterly before repairing the damage with conversation. Then, after the stones had entered into their lives, they hadn't even tried. Then insight and memory came to Urza. There had been one time, about 45 years ago, in what could be called the war's morning hours. They'd come together on the banks of the River Kor, where tumbled out of the Kur Mountains, the Yoshin warlord, his wife's father, had come to parley with the Kadir, the Falaji. Urza hadn't seen or heard from his brother for years. He'd believed that Mishra was dead, and was stunned to see him advising the Kadir. He, Urza, gods and ghosts, take note, had suggested that they should talk, and Mishra had agreed. As Urza recalled the conversation, Mishra had been reluctant, but that was his brother's style, petulant and sulky wherever his confidence was shaken. And surely it would have been shaken with the Weakstone's burden slung around his neck and the Phyrexians eating at his conscience. Surely Mishra would have confessed everything if the warlord hadn't taken it into his head to assassinate the Kadir as the parley began. Urza recalled the carnage, the look on Mishra's face. Back in Koilos, in the first snows of the 5th winter after the cataclysm, Urza staggered and eased himself to the ground. For a few moments the guilt was gone, replaced by a cold fury that reached across time to the warlord's neck. It was your fault! Your fault! But the warlord shrugged him away. He was your brother, not mine. If the Phyrexians had not taken Mishra's soul before that day on the banks of the Kor, they had surely no difficulty afterward. The blame, then, was Urza's. There was nothing he could do to ease his conscience, except, as always, in vengeance against the Phyrexians. For once, Urza was in the right place. Koilos was where the Thran had stopped the Phyrexians once, and where his own ignorance had given the enemy a second chance. If there was a way to Phyrexia, it was somewhere within Koilos. Urza left tracks in the dust as he searched for a sign. The sun had set. Koilos was tomb dark. Urza's eyes made their own light, revealing a path, less dusty than any other, that led deep into the cavern's heart. He found a chamber ringed with burnt-out power stones. 2 sooty lines were etched on the sandstone floor. Marks that might have been Thran glyphs showed faintly between the lines. Urza used his eyes to scour the spot, but the glyphs, if glyphs they were, remained illegible. He cursed and knelt before the lines. This was the place. It had to be the very place where the Phyrexians had entered Dominaria. There could be no doubt. Looking straight ahead, past the lines, the exhausted power stones, there was a crystal reliquary atop a waist-high pyramid. The reliquary was broken and empty, but the pyramid presented an exquisitely painted scene to Urza's glowing eyes. The demon he had seen in Tanos' memory. Circling the pyramid, Urza saw 2 other demonic portraits and a picture of the chamber itself with a black disc rising between the etched lines. He tore the chamber apart, looking for the disc, either its substance or the switch that awakened it. Not for the first time in his life, Urza failed. When Urza walked among the multiverse of planes, he began his journey wherever he happened to be and ended it with an act of will or memory. He realized that the Phyrexians had used another way, but it lay beyond his comprehension, as did the plane from which they'd sprung. The multiverse was vast beyond measure, filled with uncountable planes. With no trail or memory to guide him, Urza was a sailor on a becalmed sea beneath a clouded sky. He had no notion of which way to turn. I am immortal. I will wander the plains until I find their home, however long and hard the journey. And I will destroy them as they destroyed my brother.